At first, it looked like misfortune. The kind intelligence agencies are trained to accept without emotion. A meeting missed, a signal unanswered, a silence where a voice used to be. In the world of espionage, that happens. People disappear. Lines go dead. Assets fail to show up. It is uncomfortable, but it is not unexpected. Intelligence work does not promise safety. It only promises uncertainty. So when the first source vanished, the response was measured. No alarms, no panic, just procedure. But when the second one disappeared, something began to feel off. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. And by the time the fifth one vanished, investigators were forced to confront a reality they had carefully avoided. Nothing had gone wrong. No careless meeting locations. No broken tradecraft. No intercepted communications. The system had functioned perfectly, which meant the danger was not outside it. In the mid-1980s, the Cold War appeared on the surface to be cooling. Public language softened. Diplomatic visits resumed. Arms reduction talks filled headlines. To the average observer, the most dangerous period in modern history seemed to be slowly easing its grip. But beneath that surface, the intelligence war never slowed. The CIA and the KGB continued to fight a silent conflict measured not in territory, but in trust. Every document passed. Every name exchanged. Every decision carried consequences that could not be reversed. To the CIA, Soviet human intelligence was its most fragile asset. These were not machines. They were people, engineers, analysts, officers, who lived double lives under constant fear. Every contact was risky. Every message carried danger, which is why procedures were rigid, why meetings were rare, why compartmentalization was sacred, and why the losses that followed were so deeply unsettling. On June 13, 1985, in Moscow, a senior KGB officer named Sergei Motorin completed what should have been an ordinary task. He had provided classified information to an American handler, names, internal processes, insights into how the Soviet intelligence machine truly worked. This was the kind of intelligence agencies built careers on. Afterward, Motorin stepped outside. The air was warm. The street looked normal. There was no sign that his life was about to end. A black van pulled up beside him. 4 men stepped out. That was the last confirmed moment Sergei Motorin was ever seen. There were no witnesses willing to talk. No public records. No trial. Just absence. The kind that leaves no explanation behind. Inside CIA headquarters, analysts reviewed the loss. Tragic, but survivable. Assets are always at risk. Moscow was hostile territory. The KGB was aggressive. Then another source failed to appear. Then another. Different handlers, different locations, different methods. Same result. By late summer, 5 high-level assets, carefully recruited, carefully protected, had been neutralized. Some were arrested publicly. Some vanished entirely. A few were executed quietly, their deaths never acknowledged. Inside the agency, the mood shifted, because probability was no longer on their side. Someone began pinning photographs to a board. Names, dates, connections. Slowly, a pattern emerged, and with it, a realization no one wanted to voice. There was no technical explanation, no intercepted transmissions, no compromised encryption, no procedural failure, which meant the KGB was not discovering these agents. They were being handed them. That conclusion carried a weight no one wanted to lift, because it meant the threat was not foreign. It was trusted. The first response was denial. Intelligence agencies are built on trust structures. You cannot suspect everyone without collapsing the system itself. So investigators searched for explanations that preserved internal stability. And then they found one. Edward Lee Howard. Howard was a former CIA officer trained specifically for Moscow operations. He had been dismissed under questionable circumstances. He was resentful, bitter, recently disgraced. And then, just before his arrest, he defected to the Soviet Union. To the agency, Howard was a gift, a narrative that made sense, a villain with motive, a leak with a clear endpoint. Howard became the explanation for everything. Case closed, except the damage did not stop. New agents, recruited after Howard's departure, were compromised just as quickly. Names Howard had never known. Contacts he had never met. Entire networks collapsed with precision that suggested real-time access. The relief investigators had felt began to rot into something colder, because if Howard wasn't responsible, then someone else was still inside, still attending meetings, still accessing files, still trusted implicitly, and yet suspicion remained carefully contained, not because the evidence was lacking, but because the suspect did not fit the image everyone expected. Aldrich Ames was not discreet. He did not live quietly. He did not blend in. He did not behave like a man hiding secrets. He drove an expensive car, purchased a $500,000 house in cash, spent lavishly, drank openly, made no effort to disguise his lifestyle. But Ames was senior, well-connected, the son of a respected CIA officer. He belonged. In the CIA, belonging is a powerful shield. Ames worked in counterintelligence. Ironically, the division tasked with catching spies. He had access to lists of Soviet assets, names, locations, operations, everything an adversary could want. And in 1985, his life began to unravel. Debt mounted. His marriage collapsed. Alcohol became routine. Pressure closed in slowly, then all at once. And under that pressure, Ames made a decision that was not ideological, not emotional, and not complex. It was practical. He did not need to steal secrets. He already was a secret. Ames walked into the Soviet embassy and offered names, not for revenge, not for belief, for money. The KGB did not hesitate. They trusted the information immediately because it was too precise to doubt. Within days, arrests began. Some agents were confronted. Others simply disappeared. A few were executed without ceremony. And still, inside the CIA, no alarms rang. Because Ames passed polygraphs. Because he fit culturally. Because suspicion targeted outsiders, not insiders. This was not an intelligence failure. It was a psychological one. Humans are wired to trust familiarity. Authority disarms skepticism. Once someone is categorized as safe, contradictory evidence is unconsciously minimized. Ames exploited that perfectly. For 9 years, he continued, he attended meetings where losses were discussed. He listened as colleagues mourned vanished assets. He watched investigations spiral into confusion. And then he went home to a lifestyle his salary could not explain. The signs were visible. But visibility does not guarantee recognition. By the early 1990s, the damage had become impossible to ignore. Entire intelligence networks were gone. Soviet human intelligence had effectively collapsed. Lives had been lost that were never officially counted. Finally, someone noticed a chalk mark on a mailbox, a signal. Surveillance teams followed it. This time, the betrayal was caught in motion. In 1993, Aldrich Ames was arrested quietly. No chase, no public spectacle, just the sudden end of a long deception. The fallout was catastrophic. Careers ended. Procedures were rewritten. Trust fractured in ways that could not be repaired with policy alone. Ames was not brilliant. He was not subtle. He did not hide, and that was the most unsettling part. Because the most dangerous betrayal does not come from the shadows. It comes from the person no one wants to suspect. And long after the case was closed, one question continued to linger. Quiet, unresolved, and deeply uncomfortable. If it happened once, what stopped it from happening again? The arrest did not bring relief. That was the first thing investigators noticed. There was no sense of closure, no emotional release, no feeling that the danger had passed. Instead, what settled over the intelligence community was something colder and far more corrosive. Unease. Because Aldrich Ames explained how the damage happened, but not why it went undetected for so long. And more importantly, not what else might still be hidden. Inside the CIA, the days following the arrest were marked by quiet reckoning. Offices were searched. File access logs were re-examined. Conversations that once felt routine were replayed with new suspicion. Every assumption was suddenly unstable. Ames had not broken into safes. He had not hacked systems. He had not bypassed security. He had followed procedure. That was the problem. The agency had built its defenses around the idea that threats come from the outside, foreign adversaries, hostile states, unknown intruders. What was not designed to handle, what it actively resisted acknowledging, was betrayal by someone deeply embedded in its own culture. Ames had weaponized trust. He understood how investigations worked because he helped run them. He knew how red flags were evaluated, how concerns were deprioritized, how institutional confidence could override evidence. When colleagues raised quiet concerns about his spending, they were dismissed as misunderstandings. When lifestyle discrepancies surfaced, they were rationalized. When patterns emerged, they were explained away. Each individual concern was reasonable to ignore. Together, they were devastating. But hindsight does not prevent repetition. In the years that followed, the CIA rewrote policy. Financial disclosures became stricter. Polygraph programs were expanded. Internal monitoring increased. On paper, the system was stronger. Psychologically, it was fractured. Case officers who had spent decades building human networks began to doubt the organization meant to protect them. Foreign sources hesitated. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. And while the Ames case became public, its deeper implications remained largely internal, until another name surfaced. Not in Moscow, not in Washington, but inside the FBI. Robert Hanssen had spent his career chasing spies. That was his job. He worked in counterintelligence. He lectured others on security. He was known as methodical, disciplined, deeply religious. A man who did not drink, did not boast, did not draw attention. He fit the image perfectly, which is why no one looked twice. Hanssen began spying for the Soviet Union in 1979, 6 years before Ames made first contact. He did not do it out of desperation. He was not in debt. He was not disgraced. He did it because he could, because the opportunity existed, and because, like Ames, he understood something fundamental about large institutions. They trust patterns. Hanssen never met his handlers face to face. He used dead drops, coded messages, chalk marks, plastic bags hidden beneath bridges and in parks. He was meticulous, and unlike Ames, he did not flaunt his money. He kept his life deliberately ordinary. That contrast mattered. While Ames's lifestyle eventually raised questions, Hanssen's invisibility protected him. He blended into routine so completely that even when the FBI began hunting a mole, they looked everywhere except where he stood. For years, intelligence agencies were convinced there was one traitor. They were wrong. There were two, and they were operating simultaneously, in parallel institutions, with overlapping damage. Together, Ames and Hanssen compromised dozens of assets. Some were arrested. Some were executed. Others vanished into silence, their fates never confirmed. The true number will never be known. What is known is this: the damage went far beyond law sources. It reshaped how intelligence agencies viewed themselves. After Hanssen's arrest in 2001, investigators uncovered something even more troubling than betrayal itself. There had been moments, brief, quiet moments, when the truth had been close, patterns that nearly aligned, signals that almost connected, suspicions that were raised and then dismissed, not because they lacked evidence, but because acting on them would have required accusing the wrong kind of person. Senior, trusted, embedded. Psychologists later described it as institutional blindness. Organizations, especially hierarchical ones, are vulnerable to specific bias. They underestimate threats that would destabilize their identity. When acknowledging a danger would force a system to admit fundamental weakness, the system resists. Not consciously, instinctively. The result is denial that feels like rationality. After Hanssen, internal studies began examining not just espionage tactics, but human behavior. Why do insiders betray? The answer, disturbingly, was rarely ideology. It was access, opportunity, and the quiet confidence that no one would look too closely. In both cases, the traitors were not radical. They were not angry revolutionaries. They were patient, observant, and deeply aware of how their institutions worked. They did not fight the system. They moved with it, which raised a question no policy could answer. If two of the most damaging spies in American history were caught by chance rather than detection, how many were never caught at all? That question still echoes through intelligence circles. Because modern surveillance systems have grown more powerful, not less. Access has expanded. Data has multiplied. And while technology has advanced, the human mind has not evolved at the same pace. Trust remains necessary, and vulnerability remains unavoidable. Today, new counterintelligence officers are trained using the Ames and Hansen cases as warnings, not about greed, not about ideology, but about familiarity, about the danger of assuming betrayal must look a certain way, because the most effective spy is not the one who hides in the shadows. It is the one who sits beside you in the light. And even now, decades later, files remain classified, names remain sealed, questions remain unanswered, not because the truth is unknown, but because it is uncomfortable. And in intelligence, discomfort is often the first thing ignored. The story does not end with a prison door closing. That is a mistake most people make. When Aldrich Ames disappeared into a concrete cell and Robert Hansen followed years later, the public narrative settled into something neat. The traitors were caught. Justice was served. The system corrected itself. Inside intelligence circles, no one believed that, because the real damage was not the names sold, or the agents executed, or the operations dismantled. It was confidence. Confidence in the idea that loyalty could be reliably measured. Confidence in the belief that procedure equaled protection. Confidence that the system knew itself well enough to defend itself. That confidence never fully recovered. In the years after the Cold War, intelligence agencies entered a new era, one defined not by ideology but by information. Digital systems replaced paper files. Networks replaced dead drops. Access became broader, faster, and more abstract. And with that shift came a dangerous illusion, that technology could solve what psychology could not. But the lesson of Ames and Hansen was never about tools. It was about people. Both men passed background checks. Both passed polygraphs. Both were evaluated, reviewed, and trusted, because trust was necessary for the system to function. And that necessity never disappeared. In classified internal reviews, analysts reached an unsettling conclusion. Insider threats could never be eliminated, only managed. Any organization that requires secrecy, compartmentalization, and trust is structurally vulnerable to betrayal from within, not because of negligence, but because of design. The very traits that make intelligence work possible, access, autonomy, discretion, are the same traits that make it exploitable. Years later, when new whistleblowers and leakers emerged in the digital age, comparisons were inevitable. But insiders knew the difference. Some leaked out of ideology, some out of conscience, some out of protest. Ames and Hansen were different. They did not believe they were exposing wrongdoing. They did not believe they were changing history. They believed they were exploiting opportunity. And that distinction mattered, because it meant the threat was not tied to politics or eras or nations. It was tied to human nature, greed, resentment, complacency, and the quiet belief that rules apply to others. Inside CIA training programs today, there is a phrase instructors repeat without emphasis. Most damage is done by people who are trusted. It is not meant to inspire fear. It is meant to cultivate humility, because arrogance, individual or institutional, was a common thread in every failure. The assumption that experience equals loyalty, that seniority equals integrity, that obvious behavior cannot conceal hidden intent. Ames succeeded for years not because he was brilliant, but because no one wanted to believe someone like him could be guilty. And when suspicion finally arrived, it arrived too late. By then, the damage was irreversible. Families had already received notifications that never explained the full truth. Files had already been sealed to protect methods rather than memories. Names had already been erased from history. Even today, there are relatives who do not know exactly how their loved ones died, only that they did. Somewhere, quietly, that silence is intentional. Because intelligence agencies do not measure success in morality. They measure it in containment. And some truths are considered too destabilizing to fully expose. Aldrich Ames will die in prison. Robert Hansen already has. The men they betrayed will never return. And the system that failed them continues to operate, not because it's flawless, but because it must. That is the uncomfortable conclusion. There was no single moment where everything broke. There was no dramatic collapse. Just a series of small assumptions left unchallenged. A paycheck explained. A lifestyle rationalized. A suspicion postponed. Until the cost was counted in human lives. This is why intelligence agencies do not fear foreign enemies most. They fear certainty. Because certainty is what convinces people to stop looking. And somewhere right now inside some secure building, someone has access they should not misuse. Not because they intend to betray, but because systems are built by humans. And humans, when trusted absolutely, sometimes fail absolutely. That is where the story truly ends. Not with a sentence, but with a warning. Quiet, uncomfortable, and unresolved. Because the next betrayal never announces itself. It just waits.